Hello wrestling fans. Welcome back to the $20 million Pro Wrestle Machine studio and welcome back to the show. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. From the February 20th, 2023 Observer newsletter. Death of Jarrett. By Observer staff. Like leaves driven by the wind, it is a time that is no more. Jarrett quoting the movie Gone with the Wind, in a phrase he would use to talk about his glory days as a wrestler, booker, and promoter. Jarrett, a former territorial headliner, Hall of Fame promoter and legendary booker, passed away on February 14th at the age of 80. According to those close to the family, Jarrett was undergoing treatment for cancer of the esophagus and the treatment was too hard on his heart. Jarrett is one of the key figures in the history of Tennessee wrestling, first as a babyface wrestler, then as booker for Nick Gulas and Roy Welch, where he turned Memphis into the best-drawing weekly U.S. city for wrestling in the country for much of the period from 1971 through the late 80s. Jarrett opened up his own company, Jarrett Promotions, competing with Gulas and Welch in 1977, with Jerry Lawler and announcers Lance Russell and Dave Brown as the key people who went with him, even though area mainstays and people he thought were close friends, Jackie Fargo and Tojo Yamamoto stayed with Gulas and Welch. Lawler had replaced Fargo in 1974 as the territory's top star. Eventually Welch ended up with Jarrett and the company was called Jarrett Welch Promotions. Jarrett was also the booker for Georgia Championship Wrestling during the war with Ann Gunkel's All-South Wrestling, hired by Jim Barnett when he was only 31 years old because of the reputation he had from booking Tennessee. He also briefly ran the world-class promotion in Dallas where he took it from a big money loser to profitable, but after a falling out with Kevin and Kerry Von Erich, they took back over and the promotion folded shortly after. He was also Vince McMahon's pick to run the WWF when McMahon feared going to jail in 1993. Jarrett, who was elected into the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame in 2018 and the NWA Hall of Fame in 2009, was unique among those in wrestling. He was soft-spoken, would talk slowly and carefully, and at times would hide how smart he really was. Many were lulled into the idea he wasn't that smart when he was usually the smartest man in the room. One notable figure who got his first major break in Tennessee used to regularly joke with me when he'd talk to Jarrett as a performer and I'd talk to him as a promoter, knowing he'd talk to us like he was certainly a smart businessman when it came to wrestling, but still would try and make you feel like you were the smart one he was looking for advice from. And perhaps he was looking for ideas, but his doing so and making you feel smart was part of his act because he was in reality one of the smartest men in the business. Others, who have publicly tried to portray him as a Tennessee country bumpkin who could have never been successful outside that market, seem to have fallen for that. If you watch his television from the 70s and 80s, you see more of modern wrestling on that show than any of the shows from that era. Many veteran wrestlers and promoters in the 70s and 80s looked down on the gimmicks and the often low pay, although Jarrett paid far better than Nick Gulas did. But the reality is that per capita the Tennessee territory drew more television viewers and in many periods, more fans than anyone. The Memphis metropolitan area had a population of 750,000 in 1975. Crowds of 7,500 were the norm, and often 20% or more of those people watched the television show on Saturday mornings. He was a very different person when it comes to the wrestling business, said Mike Tenay, who knew him well from 2002 to 2005 when Tenay was the lead announcer for TNA. Very much the term Renaissance man away from wrestling. Every time I would get on a bus or airplane and Jerry would be there, every single time, the guy had a book. Safe to say out of all the people I've been around in wrestling, I think he was the most well-read person. Jarrett was very interested in politics and at one point was close friends with former presidential candidate Al Gore, who was a Tennessee senator, although they may have had a falling out later in life. He was almost like a philosopher in ways, said Tenay. The way he would explain things in the Tennessee Southern way, but pretty much always came across to me as a well-educated person. I'm presuming he was self-educated through reading. I never saw anybody in the wrestling business like him from a philosophical and well-read standpoint. You know him as a promoter, booker, wrestler, you meet the guy and he's so well-read in many other phases of life. He wasn't the guy that you normally run into where you say he lives in the wrestling bubble. Definitely not him. Tenay noted that as soon as he met Jarrett upon the launch of TNA, he was told that it was important that no matter how crazy the angles are, the lead announcer has to have credibility with the audience or it won't work. Even though Jarrett and Lance Russell were often on bad terms personally, he would note how Russell's credibility with the audience was one of the keys in making his promotion tick. He noted to Tenay that if Russell would tell the fans that if you're only going to go to one show a year, go this Monday, he was assured of a packed house. The reason? Russell would never say that more than once a year. If you were one of the people he did respect, he'd go out of his way to put you over and you'd feel good, said Tenay. He's the guy you'd want as your boss if you did well at your job. Tenay noted that when he took the job he was assured all the rumors of Vince Russo being involved with the company were false. He'd been assured by the Jarretts that was the case. He said that when he saw the first show format, he knew it wasn't true. Weeks later, Jerry came up to him before a production meeting and told him that he knew what he was told, and that Russo was in fact involved, and that he could quit if he wanted to and they wouldn't hold it against him. Tenay opted to stay and worked with Russo on and off for the duration of Russo's time with the company. Memphis historian Mark James, who co-wrote Jarrett's autobiography, The Best of Times, in 2012, noted that he figured out Jarrett had cancer from a recent Facebook post. A little over a month ago, Jerry had posted on his Facebook page about walking his dogs in the snow and meeting a man who had just been diagnosed with cancer. Knowing Jerry's love of literature, I read through the lines of this allegory and knew he was the one with cancer. I dropped him a quick message about it, but didn't hear back. Not wanting to bug him, I left it there. Last Tuesday night, I got a call from Jerry. We ended up talking about 30 to 45 minutes. It was a good call. He told me I had been the only one to figure out his post/story and that he was the one with cancer. We had a good laugh. He told me he had made it through the chemo and radiation. While it hadn't been easy, he was okay, just very fatigued, and while he sounded good, you could tell he was tired. It was good to talk to him. As I heard of Jerry's passing, I realized that just like Jerry had used that Facebook message a month earlier as a roundabout way of talking about his cancer fight, he had used this casual phone call as a way to say bye to me. From the money he made as a promoter in the glory days, Jarrett lived in a mansion in Hendersonville, Tennessee, neighbors with country music royalty. He had an elevator in his house. He had a giant dining room table that sat 40 to 50 people. Jarrett started up TNA Wrestling in 2002 with son Jeff and Bob Ryder, using Vince Russo as booker. Jeff and Ryder invited Jerry on Ryder's boat, since Jerry was the one who had the money and connections to money, and pitched the idea of a weekly low-cost pay-per-view show and not doing television, because television production cost money each week, while in WCW, pay-per-view events themselves, even when numbers were low, still could turn a profit. A lot of the original money came from Health South, which was a connection with Jason Hervey, who was a business partner of Eric Bischoff. Shortly into the run, Health South's finances came into question outside of wrestling, and they pulled out of funding the company. At the same time, those in charge lied to talent and everyone involved, claiming Russo was going to have nothing to do with it, even though on the inside people were aware of it, until finally they had to confess when they started bringing Russo to television. The business fell quickly deep into the red, and was going to have to fold, when Jerry and Jeff sold the majority stock to Bob Carter of Panda Industries, who put daughter Dixie Carter in charge. Carter had been hired by the Jarretts when the company formed to handle publicity with her agency, and when she found out the company may have to fold due to huge losses due to the weekly pay-per-view number being well below projections, she went to her father to buy the company and keep it alive. Jerry was still affiliated with the company in its early years until leaving in 2005 after a falling out over the direction of the company, particularly having tremendous heat with many when WWE ran a story about Jerry brokering a deal for Oleg Prudius, who later became Vladimir Kozlov, to get into the company while he was working for TNA, the rival company. He was also unhappy that after both had been used as booker at different times in the early years, that Jeff Jarrett, who was running the company, chose Russo ahead of him to be booker going forward. The Prudius story was described as the straw breaking the camel's back in regard to staying with the company, as Jeff, who was in charge, made the decision, and the two didn't speak for many years, but later reconciled. The Prudius incident led to a lot of uncertainty in TNA, as people thought Jarrett being at WWE headquarters may be a sign that their company was in trouble and that he was brokering a deal for himself and Jeff. It made Jeff look bad and scared those in his company, even though Jeff had nothing to do with it. Jarrett had serious heart and other health issues during that period. The premise that TNA started with, that they would do no television but do weekly pay-per-view shows, was obviously flawed. Years later, when I asked Jarrett about it, he said basically that sometimes your love for your son will override your business sense. Jarrett was around the wrestling business from childhood. He was born September 4, 1942 in Nashville. His mother, Christine Jarrett, known as Teenie, worked for Gulas and Welch, first as a ticket taker for the matches at the old Nashville Hippodrome and later worked in the office as a secretary. In time, she started promoting spot shows. Jerry worked with his mother in promoting small events for Gulas and Welch, doing all facets of promotion of shows while still a teenager. He left the wrestling business to attend Peabody College in Nashville. After college, He worked as a purchasing agent and wanted back in wrestling. He worked in the office for Gulas and Welch and wanted to be a wrestler. He first worked as a referee. He was dissuaded from being a wrestler because he was smaller than most wrestlers, probably around 5'8" and 175 pounds, although billed at 5'11" and 199 pounds. And in those days promotions didn't want to use wrestlers who fans didn't think were tough. Worse, if a wrestler got into a real fight in the outside world, which happened far more frequently in those days, and the wrestler lost, it was considered an embarrassment to the business, particularly when they ran grassroots shows in small communities where word traveled fast. That's why most territories wanted a roster filled with real-life tough guys. The story told was Jarrett was trained by Sailor Moran, an old tough guy who knew dirty tricks of fighting, and he told the promotion that with his teaching of those tricks, like going after the eyes as soon as the fight starts, that he'd be okay in a bad situation. Years later, Jarrett and Bill Watts had a discussion about fighting that Watts brought up to me, and Jarrett talked about over the years. Eddie Graham, who liked to book legitimate athletes to be wrestlers and was promoting 1965 NCAA champion Jack Briscoe as his top star, would always push the idea that in a real fight, Briscoe could beat anyone, particularly when he saw Briscoe out-wrestle other top amateurs in workouts. Jarrett must have said something to Watts about sticking his finger in Briscoe's eye, and Watts, who was a noted street fighter and considered in some circles a bully, would laugh at the idea that some guy with no background in real wrestling thought he could take out an NCAA champion wrestler like Briscoe. Jarrett's side of the story was that he later talked to Briscoe and noted how Eddie Graham thought nobody could take him, and Briscoe laughed it off, basically giving Jarrett the approval that he himself didn't believe that. In Jerry Lawler's book, he mentioned an incident in 1973 on the live television show where he was wrestling Jarrett, and out of nowhere, Mario Galento, a 58-year-old wrestler who had worked in the Gulas promotion at times dating back to 1951 or earlier, who was not scheduled, hit the ring and attacked Jarrett. Lawler helped Jarrett, his rival. He said Galento tried it a second time with a nightstick as a weapon and Lawler grabbed his arm. Jarrett got the stick and hit Galento in the eye with it. On Tales from the Territories that aired in October with Jerry and Jeff Jarrett, Lawler, Jimmy Hart and Dutch Mantell talking about the Tennessee promotion, their version nearly 50 years later was that promoter Roy Welch suspected Jarrett was going to try to steal his territory and sent Galento to threaten Jerry. Jerry Jarrett said Welch was in the early stages of dementia and people got in his ear telling his Jarrett was stealing his business. They were at TV in Memphis where Jarrett and Lawler had a 30-minute match. Sam Bass was Lawler's manager and Jarrett got blasted from behind and thought it was Sam. Instead it was Galento, and Jarrett nearly shit his pants. He went to his training from Moran and how he was told the hands and your bones are the weakest while the head is the hardest, so it is stupid to try to punch someone. Instead he was trained to go for the neck and bite on either side of the jugular vein so they can bleed to death. Also use your fingers to go for the eyes and feel a cord and pull as hard as you can. He jumped up and put his finger in Mario's eye and he lost his eye. In the reenactment, on the show, Mario's eye is on the mat and then Jarrett and Lawler were beating the crap out of him. Lawler soon realized in the eyes of the fans he looks like he is helping Jarrett, so he cuts a promo saying only he gets to beat Jarrett's ass. Mario finds a nightstick and comes back, but he makes the mistake of going through the ropes and Lawler starts wailing on him with the club. He was so scared that he felt he was going to have to kill him. Jarrett saw Welch in the crowd and wanted to go after him, but was pulled back by the boys. Their version was Galento ended up with 200 stitches in his head, that one eye was gone and the other eye was nearly closed, and there were gashes on his head along with a ton of bruising and swelling. Lawler says that Galento got the stitches taken out and jumped him from behind when he was wrestling a match against some young kid. Galento brought a straight razor into the ring and had his wife standing behind him. Lawler threw a chair in the ring and bailed to the back. He was screaming about Galento having a razor, so Jimmy Valiant pulled out a gun like Dirty Harry would carry and put it in Galento's face. This was in Mississippi where the sheriff was sitting front row and they all ended up arrested. Jarrett says he never saw Welch or Galento again after that. That wouldn't be correct at all since when Jarrett broke off with Gulas in 1977, the new company at first was called Jarrett Welch Promotions and Welch owned a piece of it in the early years. Jeff asks Jerry if Galento ever got his eye back and Jarrett says as far as he knew he died with only one eye in his head. Galento told two different stories about the incident. In one version, it was that he thought Jarrett as Booker screwed him and misused him, and on his own, he decided to attack Jarrett during a match with Lawler on live television. He said that Lawler, a heel, broke kayfabe by jumping Galento as he was attacking Jarrett. Lawler, always quick on his feet, did an interview saying that Galento was crazy and he wanted Jarrett for himself, and was wanting to hurt Jarrett, but wanted the satisfaction of hurting Jarrett himself. Galento claimed that later Jarrett sent people to jump him and beat him up, and he ended up in the hospital for a while, and Galento was told by those close to Jarrett and Gulas to never come to another show again. However, there was a court case in 1973 involving Galento, real name Mario Boyet, and Fargo. Galento claimed that Fargo had called him up at 4 a.m. and told him he messed with one of Jackie's boys, presumably Jarrett, and was going to blow his brains out. Galento in court claimed he wasn't afraid of Fargo, and also said that he didn't think a sober Fargo would shoot him, but he was afraid of a gun and the possibility of a drunk Fargo. He claimed in court that it was Fargo, not Jarrett as legend had it, that hit him with a stick he came to the ring with, and he ended up with 17 stitches. This made the wrestling side even madder at Galento, because by talking about wrestling being scripted but this attack being real, he was exposing the business. In 1974, Galento went on Memphis Wrestling and exposed the business outside of the court case. On the radio and in the court case, Galento said that wrestling was all a show and nothing like college wrestling, which was real, that the matches were predetermined, but not rehearsed. And a caller of the show noted that Fargo, who was said to be badly injured on Memphis TV, was headlining every Saturday night in Nashville and other cities on the circuit. Galento on the show claimed he was told he was doing a program and showed up at the studio, and the attack was a television angle and he was suckered into it when the wrestlers attacked him and beat him up. Photos of Galento showed him with two badly shut eyes and his face all bruised, as well as a massive cut from the nightstick above the left eye. In the radio interview, he talked about getting 23 stitches, being hospitalized, and that he was banned from wrestling in 37 states by commissions and no longer wrestling because he and his wife, who was a valet named Smokey, were blacklisted in 37 states, but that he also didn't want to go back because he had suffered a heart attack. For all the talk that the business being exposed to the public would hurt it, the business in 1974 was at an all-time high point. There was also a covered-up bad situation in 1973 that Jarrett never talked about but was part of territory legend. At the time, John Kazana was promoting Knoxville, and Gulas wanted Jack Donovan to screw over Kazana in some way, but he refused to do it. So at a show in Nashville, the story goes, Len Rossi took Donovan into an empty room where Fargo, Yamamoto, and Jarrett were. Jarrett and Fargo supposedly each grabbed one of Donovan's arms, and Yamamoto used one of his wooden shoes to split Donovan's head open, and he had to be hospitalized for a while. This was the version of the story Donovan told, and Dr. Ken Ramey, who managed the interns, told the same story in an interview with Scott Teal in his Whatever Happened To publication. Donovan claimed he never pressed charges because he thought if he did that he'd have been blackballed. Jarrett had his first match in 1965 when he was working as a referee and was a substitute for someone who didn't show up, but didn't wrestle regularly until 1969. He wrestled in prelims early on and was billed as a rookie hopeful. He was already booking. Jarrett had been talking in his interviews about a secret mentor he's had who was teaching him wrestling. Then, in the summer of 1970, when the interns and Ramey were giving him a beating, Yamamoto, who had been a Japanese heel in the territory since 1963 and one of its biggest stars, saved Jarrett. Jarrett then revealed Yamamoto was his secret mentor, which led to the interns' feud with Jarrett and Yamamoto that headlined 11 straight weeks in Memphis from July 6 to September 14 and was big box office at the Ellis Auditorium. Jarrett phased down wrestlers that were on top that he thought were boring, like Rossi and Dennis Hall, who had been the area's top star, and went with himself and Tojo Yamamoto as the top babyface tag team, and Fargo as the top singles star. But it was really a big three, as they do six-mans, and Jarrett would also team with Fargo or Yamamoto would team with Fargo. Yamamoto was like 5'3", but he'd been put over as a star for so long it didn't matter. The matches went by a typical formula where Jarrett would sell almost the entire match, and often bleed heavily. Yamamoto was nicknamed Lifesaver by the fans in Tennessee, because in every match he was there saving Jarrett's life. With his blonde hair and similar look to Ted Boy Marino, the biggest wrestling star ever in Brazil, the formula worked. Jarrett in particular was a big draw among younger girls who thought he was cute and would scream for him to make the tag. In many ways, Jarrett used his own role when he was younger to help promote Tommy Rich into stardom a few years later, before Rich went to Georgia and became a national star. The formula was similar with Fargo, who was a Dusty Rhodes-like character as a former heel who became the territory's biggest star with Worked Brother Don, after a period where they headlined Madison Square Garden, and then came to Tennessee, where Jackie ended up basing himself out of for the rest of his career. Jackie Fargo was a kick-ass brawler type who was great for his time period on interviews. Jerry Jarrett, on the other hand, came across as the almost shy boy next door and was there to draw women and set up his partners who were there to draw the men. He had no great magic to his booking. When I'd ask him about it, he would just say he booked based on what he liked, figuring that who and what he found entertaining would be entertaining to his audience. Tennessee was a different world when it came to wrestling. It had a terrible reputation around the country before Jarrett was there, known for terrible payoffs, and its fan base was not respected by the promoters and wrestlers who were stars in the bigger territories. Still, in the early 70s, Fargo earned more than $100,000 per year working the territory, a figure only a few wrestlers, the national stars and touring attractions were hitting. At the time, only the biggest names in traditional sports were making six figures. Lawler during the 70s was also among the highest paid wrestlers in the country even before he became part owner. His mother promoted Louisville weekly as well as other cities for him and was proud of the fact that wrestling made her a millionaire at the time when being a millionaire was a big deal. Tennessee wrestling was considered lower-end, with the idea it was less sports-like. Jarrett himself felt that Eddie Graham's championship wrestling from Florida and Vern Gagne's AWA to him were boring television shows. But Jarrett had great respect for Graham as a businessman, as he did Jim Barnett and many of the other promoters. When he was in his late 20s, he would be brought to the NWA conventions in Las Vegas and see all these millionaires and big shots, and wanted to be one of them. Despite its crowds and ratings, most promoters didn't emulate Tennessee, with the idea that what they did there would only work there. Sam Mushnick would bring in Lawler, and he was smaller than his top stars and did little actual wrestling, and felt that he was not the kind of a wrestler who could be a top star outside that very unique part of the country. The reality is that when Lawler went elsewhere, he was able to get over everywhere he had time to talk, but did not in places where he wasn't put in a key position. During the 70s, Memphis had years where it ran almost every Monday night and would average more than 7,000 paid each week. Memphis and Houston were the top weekly wrestling cities in the country as far as drawing went, and they couldn't have been more different. Houston had the biggest stars and Paul Bosch was noted for paying well. Tennessee relied on local wrestlers who weren't paid, but it worked due to the storylines and angles. Louisville, a Tuesday night city promoted by Teeny, was also among the better weekly cities in the U.S. No city in the country drew television ratings like Jarrett's crew did on WHBQ TV and later WMC TV in Memphis. It was Russell's idea, when he was the program director at WHBQ Television, to move wrestling to Saturday mornings 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. He was scoffed at. While wrestling was certainly popular with young kids, which Saturday morning television in that era was based on, most of its audience was adults. The kids usually stopped watching cartoons by 11 and adults weren't watching television until Wide World of Sports in the late afternoon. It was considered a death slot, which is why Russell thought it was the perfect time. Russell noted how heavily criticized he was for the move and considered it the baggiest and best decision he ever made as a program director. Wrestling on WHBQ was one of the strongest television shows in the Memphis market, even beating most network prime-time shows. It was Russell who convinced his friend Dave Brown to be his co-announcer in 1967, and also gave him his job as the weatherman on the station, telling him that you will be more well-known for doing wrestling than being on television nightly doing the weather. Not only did he help build Memphis wrestling, I think that he built wrestling in general, said Dave Brown. In my opinion, Jerry Jarrett is responsible for reforming wrestling, so that when Vince McMahon started his big push with the WWF and WWE, it was something a mass audience could enjoy. Memphis and the other regions booked by Jarrett were doing so well that when Bill Watts left Georgia for Florida in 1973 to book for Eddie Graham, Jim Barnett, who was running Georgia and in a war with Ann Gunkel, hired the 31-year-old Jarrett to book Georgia. Jarrett claimed that he was swindled by Gulas and that he was paying Gulas money for what he thought were points in the company that he would eventually take over. He claimed after paying $50,000, Gulas essentially told him it wasn't for points in the company. Jarrett was furious and decided to start his own promotion to go against Gulas. At the time, it appeared risky. There was a huge advantage for the long-time promotion between the traditional television time, fan base and history, plus talent would be wary of leaving a promotion backed by the NWA. Gulas had such a long history in the market that people figured he would always be the man in charge. But the most powerful NWA promoters considered Gulas and Tennessee wrestling as something they put up with, but didn't respect, even though Gulas ran a huge territory that in the 70s was very successful. Jarrett as booker had been attending the NWA conventions in Las Vegas for years, and was obvious close to people like Jim Barnett and Eddie Graham from booking Georgia. In a power play, Sam Mushnick resigned as NWA president in 1975 after feeling insulted by the alliance, who complained about his taking a booking fee and having so much power over the finishes of the world title matches in different territories, in the sense he would limit the 60-minute draws for the health of the champion, limit non-title losses for the credibility of the champion, and insist upon at the end of programs, The champion would ultimately prevail to show the strength of the belt. The other key is that Barnett agreed to book the champion for no money, basically saving the promoters 2.5% of the gate that they had paid Mushnick to get the champion. At this point, Graham was the NWA president and Barnett was booking the champion. Not only would the key promoters like Graham, Barnett, and Jim Crockett Jr. not help Gillis run out the outsider, but they basically sided with Jarrett, and very early in the war, world champion Harley Race came to Memphis on a Jarrett show, not a Gillis show. When Jarrett made the move, he had a few other key aces up his sleeve. Lawler, who Jarrett booked to be the top star in 1974, having him go over in the end in a major feud with the aging Fargo that led to one of the best attendance runs in city history. He followed that up with Lawler's quest for the world title, where he'd bring in the biggest national stars he could get to headline with Lawler. They were drawing over 10,000 fans weekly that summer. During that era, Memphis would peak in the summer when school was out and parents were more likely to let their kids to go the Coliseum on Monday with no school the next day, unlike many promotions that considered summer a slow period because of weather, vacations, and less people watching the television shows. Getting Lawler to come with him was the key, and Russell, the popular voice of wrestling, was the other key, and program director at WHBQ was the other. He hired Russell full-time, taking him away from his full-time work as a television station programmer. Jarrett went to WMC-TV, the NBC affiliate, with the proposal that he would give them a Saturday morning television show that would be their most popular show aside from network primetime, and beat much of network primetime as well. Everyone in Memphis television knew the popularity of Saturday morning wrestling. In addition, he would get Brown, the most popular weatherman in the market on WHBQ, to switch over to WMC. The deal was made and the rest was history. Jarrett quit Gillis and began starting up his new promotion, which had to run in the Cook County Convention Center starting on March 20, 1977. Gillis did huge business at the time with Jarrett as booker in Western Tennessee. But Eastern Tennessee, where Gillis used Son George as a headliner, wasn't doing as well, and Gillis was pushing Jarrett to feature George in Memphis, which he didn't want to do. A February 20th show with Lawler vs. Bob Armstrong in a cage drew 10,526, and March 1st with Harley Race defending the NWA title against Rocky Johnson, and Lawler vs. Tommy Rich, who somewhat played an updated version of the role Jarrett had years earlier, drew a sellout of 11,257. Lawler and the Stars continued to work with Gillis until March 14, 1977, when almost everyone of note jumped to Jarrett's group that ran its first show in Memphis on March 20, 1977 at the Cook Convention Center, because Gillis had the deal for the Monday night shows at the Coliseum. With almost all the familiar stars and Russell, Dave Brown wasn't there at first because he had to fulfill his television contract with WHBQ as weatherman. On Jarrett's new television show, Gillis died an immediate death in Memphis, which in wrestling was so quick it was considered the equivalent of the Six-Day War in the 60s. He was forward-thinking, he was meticulous, said Brown to the Memphis Commercial Appeal. He was great at coming up with storylines, and that was a key to the success of Memphis wrestling. It was like Saturday morning soap opera. Gillis' March 21st show with the Sheik vs. Bobo Brazil for the U.S. title, who had both been huge draws against Lawler when they'd be brought in, and was one of the biggest feuds in pro wrestling history, drew just 1,964. The next 2 weeks drew 1,599 and 1,148. After that show, the Coliseum switched allegiances and allowed Jarrett's crew in, but also allowed Gillis to continue to run. On April 27th, Jarrett is given a shot in the Coliseum and drew 8,693 for Race vs. Johnson for the NWA title, Lawler vs. Jack Briscoe for the Southern title, and Phil Hickerson and Dennis Condrey vs. Dusty Rhodes and Tommy Gilbert for the Southern tag titles. Gillis pulled out for 3 weeks trying to regroup and returned May 2nd and did 1,474 for Sheik defending against Fargo. The next week, with Fargo beating the Russian Stomper for the Central States title, the crowd was down to 474. Jarrett's second show was 2 nights later, with Lawler vs. Robert Fuller, and drew 4,887, and a week later, the war was over, as Gillis lost the Coliseum over poor attendance, and Lawler vs. Ron Fuller for Jarrett drew 7,122. For a few years, they had an agreement that Gillis would get the Nashville end of the state, but Jarrett controlled the best drawing markets, Memphis and Louisville. Jarrett was also confident Gillis would fail by building so much around his son, George Gillis, who was 6'6" but a poor in-ring performer. By 1980, Gillis Promotions was out of business. From 1977 until the mid-80s, the glory period of Jarrett Promotions, the money was made based on how they drew in Memphis mainly, and to a lesser extent Louisville, Nashville, Evansville, and other smaller markets. But the television ratings were enormous. The shows would do between an 18 and 24 rating, meaning the percentage of homes in the Memphis viewing area that averaged watching the full 90-minute live show from the WMC TV studios. The share would range from 60 to 75, meaning of the homes actually watching television on Saturday morning, that was the percentage watching wrestling. About 175,000 viewers in the Memphis area alone watched wrestling on Saturday mornings on average over 90 minutes, and 300,000, more than one-third of the population, would tune in and watch at least some of the show. The show also never had a lead-in to speak of. Russell noted that the number of people who specifically would tune into the station at the start of the wrestling show was like no other program in the market and few others in any market. It was so popular that at one point during the peak, if a World Series baseball game aired on NBC during the wrestling time slot, they would still air wrestling. Even in 1985 and 1986, when Saturday night's main event was a big hit, Jarrett and Lawler had so much pull with the station that they didn't air that show, which was highly rated in the market, although during that period Russell noted to me that this wouldn't last forever, and that in time, their company would not be able to compete with WWF, even though they were killing WWF in the market when it came to ratings and live attendance at the time. He said this when most in wrestling were oblivious to that, thinking no farther ahead than next week's gate. When the house shows started dropping but ratings were still enormous, Russell also noted that it was the house show numbers to pay attention to, and the ratings will stay up because television viewers are creatures of habit and will watch because that's what they do, but your real popularity is how many people buy tickets, and those spikes and drops will precede those of the ratings. At one point in time, wrestling was the second highest rated show of any kind in the market, behind only the blockbuster soap opera Dallas. Memphis was way ahead of the curve with angles and developing unique gimmicks. But by the late 80s, and even more into the 90s, the glory days were over. Even when business was strong, Jarrett never had a reputation for paying well, unless you were Lawler, who he had to take care of. When Lawler and Russell threatened to do what Jarrett did to Gulas and Breakaway, since they were the two leading wrestling personalities on television, along with Brown, who would always be loyal to Russell since he gave him his biggest broadcasting breaks, Jarrett made Lawler a 50% owner of the business. Jarrett was never mad at Lawler for doing it, saying he understood and it was Lawler who was drawing the money. But he was furious at Russell. Jarrett claimed that he kept Russell but cut his salary, as Russell was the second highest paid employee besides Lawler. Russell, who hated Jarrett in the aftermath, although the two later reconciled long after the promotion folded, always claimed that story to be untrue, saying Jarrett gave him a raise at that point to pacify him. The loss of Jimmy Hart to WWF as Lawler's perennial adversary hurt badly. They did draw good crowds after Hart left, including a few sellouts, but they were fewer and farther in between. Hart noted that even though he wasn't used as the top manager and the catalyst heel in WWF, he noted that he'd go out for multiple matches a night, work 6 days a week, take big bumps for the babyfaces for $250 a week. In that era, many of the wrestlers were driving hundreds of miles for $25 payoffs. The idea was that if you went to Tennessee, you would starve, but the benefits were that even during the period when they were no longer drawing, you were still on television every week and a star. The idea is you go there, and there were still many women fans since they tried to promote around good-looking younger guys, and guys were supposed to find willing women to move in with, so no rent, have them cook for them and take care of them, and eventually most would move on. Jarrett defended paying so poorly by saying that his territory was like college. You come here to learn the craft and get your wrestling education, and like a doctor or anyone, you run in debt while in college to learn, but make your money after you leave college, particularly in the 90s when WWF, WCW and Japan were paying very well, and there was always the need for young talent and few places to get that television and live working experience 6 days a week. But eventually by the mid-90s, even that wasn't working well. Lawler remained the top star. Jarrett's son Jeff, as the number 2 babyface behind Lawler, and Lawler's son Brian, as heel Brian Christopher, joined Lawler and Bill Dundee in the top mix for years, and the top tag team was often PG-13, which consisted of Dundee's son Jamie, JC Ice, and Wolfie D. Jerry Jarrett told me that unlike so many of the other promoters who only knew wrestling and kept running, thinking the cyclical turnaround was coming, he didn't run a business to lose money. He realized his days of living high based on wrestling were over, and got into the construction business, basically saying that if he wanted to continue his affluent lifestyle, he had to find a new way because the days of wrestling allowing him to live like that were over and were not going to come back. He was about to fold the business when Lawler offered him $250,000 for his 50%, which he considered at the time a gift from heaven. Larry Burton had already put together a deal with Cleveland investors which was really just a big con, who would buy the territory for $1 million. Jarrett didn't know, or he could have waited and sold and his half would be twice what he got for it. Lawler, owning the entire territory and as the star, got a deal as the top wrestler for far more than he had been earning. The new investors lost money fast, didn't make all the television ad sales money they were told by Vince McMahon, who helped Lawler in this swindle, and the company folded in 1997. The new owners understood the business so well that they fired Russell, an institution in the market, on the belief he was too old. In 1993, Jarrett went to Connecticut to be groomed by Vince McMahon to take over his company if McMahon was to go to jail. He lived with McMahon in McMahon's home at the time, but admitted that he couldn't keep pace with McMahon's nonstop work. He later said he was thrilled when McMahon wasn't convicted, and he loved leaving Connecticut, where he never felt he belonged, and returning to Tennessee. Jarrett put together a group that attempted to purchase WCW in 2000. He noted that even though the company was losing more than $5 million per month, that it was still taking in $125 million. He figured he could just make cuts and be exceedingly profitable with that revenue, plus with him in charge, the booking wouldn't be as atrocious as it had been since the latter stage of 1998 when it started to falter. But Turner Broadcasting never considered his offer, said to be for $20 million, and first went with a group headed to Eric Bischoff, and then sold to Vince McMahon for $2.5 million. Much has been talked about regarding that decision over the years, and Jarrett himself never got a straight answer why his group's offer was never considered. It was that Turner felt that none of the offers were stable groups, and that McMahon at least was a stable group. And once they canceled the television, the value of the sale was minimal. When they were still planning on keeping the television, which meant McMahon, with his exclusive deal with Spike, couldn't buy the company, they went with Bischoff because he had run the company during its period of its greatest success, as opposed to Jarrett, whose deal wasn't as lucrative. Jarrett got back into the business in 2002 with TNA. McMahon wasn't going to give his son, Jeff Jarrett, a job at the time he purchased the remnants of WCW in 2001. In McMahon's eyes, Jeff, who had the IC title when his contract expired and Jarrett got a better offer from WCW, held McMahon up for a number in the range of $200,000. In McMahon's eyes, Jarrett would say he was just to make sure he got all the money he was due from the company after leaving, to lose the title to China in his last match. Jeff and Ryder convinced Jerry to get into business, with the idea they would bypass the cost of producing television by only promoting $9.95 weekly pay-per-view shows. They convinced him that if they could get 50,000 viewers per week, with a pay-per-view split, that would be $13 million in annual income. Even in its best years, Jarrett Promotions running territorially never came close to that. Jarrett talked when promoting this idea about the idea that at such a low price, they could get 500,000 buys a week, meaning $130 million in revenue, which was preposterous. But the reality was they did 10,000 buys by week 3 and they stayed between 8,000 and 10,000 except for some of the special shows during the Nashville Fairgrounds era. They were one step from bankruptcy when Bob Carter bought out 72% of the company and put his daughter, who went to her father for the promotion-saving deal, in charge. The hope of starting the group was that TNA would be the replacement for the disenfranchised fans of WCW. Jarrett had talked with Barnett, who noted that Ted Turner wasn't happy with the way McMahon handled the purchase of WCW on television, feeling McMahon was somewhat rubbing his nose in it, which he was. Turner had a non-compete in the sale that would go until 2004. When it ended, Turner was interested in starting a promotion for his stations. Jarrett was aware and pitched it to Barnett, but Turner wanted to own the promotion. In a meeting with Barnett and Bill Shaw, Barnett estimated it would cost Turner $50 million in startup costs, and Turner's fortunes had been depleted by a merger going bust and felt that investment was too high for him at the time. Friction formed because Jeff felt that Vince Russo would be a better booker than his father, feeling Russo was more modern in his approach. With Jerry, who many times was bemused with the idea that he, one of the most successful bookers in history, would be told Russo was better for the times. It was a real slap in the face. Jerry did at times book TNA, and his long-term vision was better, but the company wasn't going to be successful in that form no matter what. But he was replaced by Russo, who was the original booker. They abandoned that formula by buying time on Fox Sports Net and cutting PPVs back to monthly, and the monthly shows with television support did far better and were often the best pay-per-view shows in the US at the time. But they still couldn't make money on it. Jarrett sometimes booked. Russo sometimes booked. Dusty Rhodes was brought in to book at one point. Over the years after leaving TNA, Jarrett had other ideas, such as doing a promotion where you would have judges rate the matches like in gymnastics and choose the winners and stars in that way. He was not the only promoter who had ideas like that. Jarrett, Nick Bockwinkel and a few others all at one time or another approached me with that type of new concept of wrestling, with the idea of judges who would be wrestlers and those with experience covering and being around wrestling. But he was never able to get a television deal for his different ideas to get off the ground. Every few years a story would break about Jarrett wanting to get back into promoting wrestling, but they never went anywhere. Like everyone, he did a podcast. He was very realistic when talking about his era, saying it was a wonderful time, but it ended, and such a time could never come back. I loved the business during the era that I was active, but like the famous lines in the movie, like leaves driven by the wind, it is a time that is no more, he said about 10 years ago. It is gone with the wind. I enjoy talking about those days. I happen to think those days were the glory days of the business. They certainly were for me anyway. However, the kids that are wrestling today are making memories, regardless of them realizing it or not. As a wrestler, Jarrett's period as a babyface headliner in the territory went from 1970 to 1976, where he held the Southern Tag Team title 7 times with Yamamoto and 6 times with Fargo, as well as twice with Johnny Marlin, British wrestler Johnny Eagles, who came to Tennessee, and because he looked so much like established star Eddie Marlin, who was Jarrett's father-in-law, that the promotion claimed they were half-brothers. He held the NWA World Tag title with Fargo once, the Southeastern Tag title twice with Yamamoto, and the Tennessee Tag title once with George Gulas. Jarrett and Yamamoto did comeback runs in 1980-81 where they won the CWA World Tag Team title, and again in 1985-86, and did sporadic matches including during the USWA vs. SMW feud, in 1995, with Bob Armstrong, who in USWA played the heel commissioner of SMW, which were his last career matches. Wrestling had historically been held at the Ellis Auditorium, which opened in 1924 and held about 7,000 fans. It's where Lawler as a fan would attend in high school and do the drawings that he sent to Russell. It's where Jimmy Hart grew up and would sell concessions before he had his short-lived rock and roll stardom with the Gentrys. Elvis Presley used to be snuck into the building in the back where nobody would see him buy Guy coffee, particularly when they featured women wrestlers. The first show when moving to the Mid-South Coliseum in Memphis was June 7, 1971, which drew 9,253 fans for Al and Don Green beating Jarrett and Yamamoto via DQ in a hair match. Over the years, the hair match was used as the company's biggest drawing match, and Lawler in particular, whether a face or a heel, always won the hair match. In Lawler's most famous area feud with Bill Dundee, 2 of the most memorable matches were Lawler beating Dundee for his hair on September 5, 1977, before 10,129 fans, and the next week, Dundee put up the hair of wife Beverly Dundee, and Lawler won again, before 9,000 fans. Lawler would mock Dundee for having to sleep with a bald woman, and that match was part of a feud that lasted for decades, even doing local independent matches when both were long past their prime and the territory had closed. Jarrett headlined the first 5 shows of the Coliseum, and that year was regularly featured teaming with Fargo or Yamamoto against the Greens, the Von Brauners, the Infernos, and the Interns. Feuds with the Von Brauners and Interns were brought back many times, as well as later feuds with the likes of Lawler and Jim White, the Bounty Hunters, Green, and Phil Hickerson. That threesome also headlined throughout the circuit and were the building blocks of the weekly shows at the Louisville Gardens, which the company started running in 1970. His first sellout wasn't until the summer of 1972, a Fargo vs. Al Green hair match which fans were shocked when Green won. Longtime area mainstays Randy Hales and Dave Brown had both over the years remarked to me how memorable that show was, with Brown talking about the interviews that Saturday before the match being etched into his head as much as anything he ever broadcasted, and Hales, watching on television, would say that was what made him a fan. The two continued their program and weeks later built to another sellout in an I Quit match in a cage that Fargo won. An early 1973 feud with Fargo and Jarrett vs. Lawler and Jim White was another major run with crowds in the 10,000 range, which was the first time Lawler proved to be a drawing card. Lawler's first main event sellout was April 9, 1973, with Lawler and White losing a cage match to Yamamoto and Roughhouse Fargo, Jackie's brother who played a crazy man and was Jarrett's biggest part-time attraction draw for years, an even bigger short-term draw than when he would bring in Andre the Giant. A week later, a hair match, where Roughhouse got his head shaved, did another sellout. The Roughhouse Fargo story is that he and Jackie had been a regular brother tag team, and they were brothers, unlike Don, who obviously was not, but Roughhouse was supposedly insane, and did a comedy act. The idea was that Roughhouse was locked up in a mental institution, and every year or two, Jackie would get so mad at a heel that he would get Roughhouse out for a few weeks. In reality, Roughhouse was Sonny Fargo, a regular referee for Jim Crockett Promotions, And he'd get a few weeks off every now and then to become one of the most unlikely big drawing attractions of that era. In 1974, they had sellout 6 out of 7 weeks with Lawler on top against Ricky Gibson twice, Jackie Fargo 3 times and The Sheik. They did 7 straight sellouts in 1975 at one point, with the Mongolian Stomper as the top guy, wrestling against Lawler and the Magnificent Zulu, Ron Pope. Jack Briscoe as world champion drew big that year with Lawler and Ron Fuller. In 1976, a Jarrett vs. Al Green no DQ hair match drew a near sellout of 10,800. Lawler vs. Rocky Johnson in a match billed as a top 10 heavyweight wrestler against a top 10 heavyweight boxer drew the only sellout of the year, but Lawler did near sellouts multiple times with Johnson, as well as with Jack Briscoe and Terry Funk. Before the split with Gulas, Jarrett had 2 sellouts in 1977, one for Lawler vs. the Mongolian Stomper and the other for Harley Race vs. Johnson for the NWA title. After Gulas was run out, Lawler drew a sellout with Bill Dundee, a near sellout with NWA champion Harley Race, as well as big crowds for the famous hair matches with Dundee, which were referred to in build-ups for future matches for nearly the next 2 decades. In 1978, there were 2 sellouts, one with Lawler vs. Jimmy Valiant and another with Nick Bockwinkel defending the AWA title against Lawler, and Lawler's biggest drawing opponents with Valiant and Jos LeDuc. The big angle at that point was Lawler was going to retire and become a singer with the Gentrys, a Memphis band of high school friends from Treadwell High, including Jimmy Hart. They had a national following in the 60s and early 70s with songs like Cinnamon Girl and Why Should I Cry, with its big hit Keep on Dancing hitting number 4 on the Billboard charts in 1965, and would be featured on American Bandstand with Dick Clark and tour with both the Beach Boys and Sonny and Cher. The Gentrys' glory days were over and it was a way to get the band some publicity locally. Lawler did briefly retire, released an album, and during his first concert, Valiant attacked some of the band members and broke a guitar over Lawler's head. This caused Lawler to abandon his musical career and return to wrestling looking for revenge. That was the type of outside-the-box angles that Jarrett and Lawler did, working together. The general rule is that Jarrett felt bookers go into burnout. So he would book for 6 months, and then take a 6-month break as head booker, and Lawler would book that period. Lawler's booking was more wacky. Dundee was also around for creative input during much of this period. 1979 was a down year, with most weeks doing 3,500 to 7,500, and the biggest crowds for when Bockwinkel would come in to defend against Lawler. In February 1980, Lawler suffered a broken leg playing flag football with his buddies. Jarrett was furious at Lawler for doing that because the territory was built around him and hated Lawler playing softball and football, and he felt risking the territory. Lawler had been managed by Hart at the time. Lawler did most of the talking. Hart, a fan since childhood who was actually a great athlete as a high school football star at Treadwell High, the same school Lawler went to years later, became a local celebrity with the Gentrys and got into the business shortly after Lawler did the angle with the band. He was down on his luck at the time, and loved pro wrestling since childhood, and he and Lawler became fast friends because neither drank, smoked or did drugs, which was somewhat a rarity among both rock stars and pro wrestlers of that era. The injury was the catalyst for one of the greatest long-term feuds in area history. With Lawler gone, Hart began talking and ended up over the next few years as the best manager in the business, even ahead of Bobby Heenan. The first thing he did was say that when a horse breaks his leg, you shoot it, and then he gave the crown as the new king of wrestling to Valiant, who became the top heel star. The territory overall did not do well without Lawler, many crowds under 4,000. The biggest crowds were for Billy Robinson as CWA champion and Nick Bockwinkel as AWA champion, and the only sellout was Lawler's December 29th comeback show where he beat Dream Machine, which gave him a match with Hart. In the heyday, Jarrett's live television show would air in Memphis, and then, a 60-minute version of the 90-minute show, with localized interviews, would air in the other markets the next weekend. The idea, which wasn't always possible, was to run the Monday Memphis matches in the other markets a week later. So instead of doing the same matches and finishes Monday in Memphis, Tuesday in Louisville, and Wednesday in Evansville, the idea was Monday in Memphis, the next Saturday in Nashville, 8 days later in Louisville, and the next night in Evansville. When booking stars out of the territory, that wasn't always possible, so the 30 minutes of the television show pertaining to the talent that wasn't working the other cities was what was usually edited out. Plus, in later years, Lawler would only work Louisville and Evansville once a month, and they would book smaller towns near Memphis, so Lawler didn't have to travel as much. Crowds were up in 1981, although the only sellout was a Lawler and Valiant tag match against Dream Machine and Bugsy McGraw. Lawler vs. Machine and Hart was the biggest feud of the year, but they did a big crowd for a Steve Kieran and Dundee vs. Atsushi Onita and Masafuchi hair match. The number of top stars who came through his territory was endless, from Hulk Hogan starting as Terry the Hulk Boulder, Steve Austin, who got his name working for Jarrett when they told him there was already another Steve Williams so he had to use a different name, The Rock, in the dying days of the promotion as Flex Kavana, who Russell told me immediately was going to be a big star one day, on down. When Jim Hellwig and Steve Borden, two big bodybuilders who became Ultimate Warrior and Sting, sent photos to every major promoter after just a few weeks of training, Jarrett was the only one who responded. They were there for only about 10 weeks, starting as babyfaces Steve Flash Borden and Jim Justice Hellwig, before going heel as the Blade Runners Flash and Rock. A few weeks later, Bill Watts brought them in, to the chagrin of a lot of his talent because he cut some experienced and far better wrestlers, and renamed Flash as Blade Runner Sting. When Michael Hayes and Terry Gordy came in and asked to play Free Bird on their way to the ring, he agreed while the other promoters thought it was stupid, even though it was already done in Japan and Argentina. The Freebirds and Bad Leroy Brown, California, were the earliest Americans to use entrance music. Jarrett popularized the Fabulous Ones, Stan Lane and Steve Kieran, and the Rock and Roll Express, Ricky Morton and Robert Gibson, through music videos, which his television show pioneered back in the 70s with Lawler and entrance music. The older wrestlers and promoters thought it was nonsense, even though it was already a staple in other countries, and Russell noted that the fans loved it when his contemporaries claimed it was ruining wrestling. At one point they even tried to increase Lawler's popularity outside of wrestling by releasing singles and albums where he would sing with the idea they could get local radio airplay in an era where everyone listened to pop music on their AM radios. Through the television show, Lawler's local Q rating, percentage of people who knew and could identify him in the market, was staggering, and his second wedding, in 1982, to Paula Carruth, was officiated by Memphis Mayor Bill Morris. Jim Harris came in and they made videos in Jarrett's backyard pretending to be in the jungles of Uganda and created Kimala, the Ugandan giant. Jim Cornette was a teenage photographer and wrote the programs and wrestling magazines, and in 1982, Jarrett said that he found Cornette to be someone he just naturally saw as rubbing people the wrong way and thought was obnoxious, and figured if he got annoyed by him, he could put him on television and the fans would as well. And that was a good thing for a heel manager. So he came up with the idea of the spoiled rich son of a wealthy mother. Cornette went on to be one of the top managers of all time. One of Jarrett's most successful angles was in 1976, when the Muhammad Ali vs. Antonio Inoki match was being promoted. He wanted to play off the boxer versus wrestler theme using Lawler. Rocky Johnson was an experienced wrestler who had been a headliner in many places and was actually one of the top stars in the business. But he had never worked in Memphis. Jarrett wanted him to come in, and with Jarrett's reputation for pay, Johnson insisted on a $500 per week guarantee at first. Johnson was brought in as a top 10 ranked heavyweight boxer, and even though boxing rankings were carried in the newspapers monthly and Johnson had never had a pro boxing match, he had been a sparring partner of both Ali and George Foreman prior to this time. He was billed as a boxer who knew no wrestling. While Johnson came in as an arrogant boxer who thought he'd knock out Lawler, the fans loved him and he was kept on, with the storyline that he was training to be a wrestler, and was soon the Southern champion. Lawler vs. Johnson was one of the most successful long-term feuds in territory history. The first match, held 4 days before Ali vs. Inoki, sold out the Coliseum with 11,188 fans. Jarrett and Lawler were often criticized for not letting newcomers who got hot stay over. He'd put them over early, but nobody was allowed to be more over than Lawler. To a degree this changed when the Fabulous Ones got hot and were drawing women, but Lawler was still clearly the top star. Jarrett always noted that it would be foolish to allow someone to get over more than Lawler, because everyone, including the Fabulous Ones, would leave, but Lawler was never leaving. Plus he felt that some people may be able to get hot for a short period of time, but nobody could stay over and draw in weekly cities like Lawler could. Lawler also had the ability to have good matches with people who were bad wrestlers. So impressive but very green wrestlers, like a young Hogan, then Terry the Hulk Boulder, could come in and Lawler could carry him to good enough matches to headline repeatedly. The most famous feud ever in the territory on a national basis was Lawler vs. Andy Kaufman. While memory has those involved like Lawler and Jarrett talking about that feud as selling out the building, they actually never had a sellout. In the early parts of the feud, they did well above average numbers, including 8,091 for the first match where Lawler laid out Kaufman with a pile driver, but the next week without Kaufman did 9,121. But most weeks were 4,000 to 5,000 and 7,000 was considered a good crowd. Lawler vs. Kimala, as it was spelled at that time, as Lawler read a book about Uganda and there was a Dr. Kimala in the book, was actually the biggest drawing feud of that year in Memphis with 2 straight sellouts and a third crowd of more than 10,000. But in early 1983, they did the brilliant spot where Lawler had destroyed Jimmy Hart in a match prior to Lawler winning the AWA title from Nick Bockwinkel, which ended up being held up in Memphis only. In the rematch, with Hart in Bockwinkel's corner wrapped up from head to toe, suddenly Hart, with no bandages, came out to distract Lawler. This caused Lawler to lose to Bockwinkel, and then the guy everyone thought was Hart took his bandages off, revealing Kaufman. Lawler in a handicap match with Kaufman and the Colossus of Death was one of only 2 shows in 1983 to top 9,000, the other being a Lawler vs. Dundee legendary loser leaves town match that sold out. Lawler even teamed with Kaufman once against Hart and the Assassin, but Kaufman turned on Lawler in that scenario. By the latter stages they were doing 3,000 to 3,500 fans, worse than without him as the feud ran its course. As big as the Kaufman angle was, in 1977 they were working on one that would have dwarfed it. The idea was to do a Lawler vs. Elvis Presley match. Presley was a big fan, and they'd sell him as a threat because he had a karate background, with the idea of wrestling versus karate. Talks were ongoing when Presley suddenly passed away. In 1984 things were down generally, but the bright spots were establishing Rick Rude, who had been a prelim wrestler elsewhere, as a legitimate main event draw with Lawler and others. The Road Warriors were also big draws against the Fabulous Ones and Lawler and Austin Idol, doubling the usual crowds to the 10,000 mark. There were other bright spots over the years, such as the Lawler vs. Randy Savage feud in 1985 that culminated in the loser leaves town match so Savage could go to WWF. On December 30, 1985, they had the biggest match in years. It was Lawler vs. Dundee in a loser leaves town for 6 months match. Dundee, to get the match, put up both his hair and his wife's hair once again. Lawler had beaten Dundee in their classic loser leaves town match a few years earlier and wanted another crack. Dundee, who had been a long-time babyface, was a major heel at this point. Dundee cheated to win a classic brawl that drew a sellout of 11,300 fans in a terrible snowstorm. The bad part is that in the other cities on the circuit, they were scheduled to repeat that match and finish and would have also drawn sellouts for such an encounter, but the storms were so bad those matches had to be cancelled. Lawler had told me at the time that they knew business would go down and they didn't expect him to be gone for 6 months, but for business when he returned, the idea was the longer he was gone, the bigger the return was. Lawler worked in other places, including for Liam Ivia's Polynesian Pro Wrestling, so he got trips to Hawaii during his time off. He said the angle would continue until crowds fell under 3,000 in Memphis, meaning they were losing money on the shows. At that point, he'd return. Dundee would headline for the next 2 months against people like Big Red Reese, Austin Idol, Steve Keirn, Coco Ware, Terry Taylor and Dirty Rhodes, Roger Smith, doing a Dusty Rhodes act and billed as his cousin. Smith usually worked the territory and other territories as one of the assassins in that period. They only got through February. On March 1st, in one of the greatest 90-minute TV shows Jarrett and Lawler ever produced, they did the angle for Lawler's return. Dundee and Buddy Landel attacked and beat up Jeff Jarrett, then an 18-year-old referee who had not started wrestling yet. Jerry Jarrett, who would almost never appear on television but was acknowledged as the owner of the company, ran in to make the save, only to get beaten down. Jarrett was in tears talking to Russell and Brown after the beating, talking about how he was unable to protect his son, and there was only one thing left to do, and that was bring back Lawler. They had a large telephone on the announcer's desk and called Lawler at home, and Lawler was watching the show and of course cut the great promo and vowed to be back on Monday. Dundee vowed to sue for the breaking of the stipulation. Jarrett said he didn't care about a lawsuit and that Dundee needed to pay. 2 nights later, a sellout of 11,300 fans came to see Lawler and Dutch Mantel beat Dundee and Landel. About 4,000 fans were turned away at the door. They had a second sellout the next week, and drew more than 10,000 the third week. On March 24th, in a match generally considered one of the best of the decade of the 80s, Lawler and Mantel beat Dundee and Landel in a Texas death match that went 49 minutes and ended when Dundee and Landel couldn't answer the bell for the 27th fall. They had a return death match the next week, until Lawler beat Dundee on April 7th in a no-DQ cage match to win the Southern title. That show was notable for Jeff Jarrett's debut as a wrestler at the Coliseum, going to a draw with Tony Falk. By April 21st, Jeff Jarrett was in the main event, teaming with Lawler and Jos LeDuc to beat Dundee and Landel and Falk. After that, the business was steady but at a much lower level. Within a few years, 2,000 was considered a good number, and sometimes crowds at the Coliseum was under 1,000. That was a comeback in 1987, with Lawler both feuding and then teaming with Bockwinkel, The ascension of Idol and Rich as a heel headliner tag team managed by Paul E. Dangerly, Paul Heyman, who Jarrett felt the name Dangerously, the name Heyman wanted to use, was too confusing, where Lawler would bring in former enemy Bam Bam Bigelow as his partner. Plus, early in the year, Fabulous Ones, the top-drawing babyface team from a few years earlier, returned and picked up Gates with wild brawls with the Sheepherders. They drew several crowds from 7,000 to 9,000 during this period. Lawler and Idol feuded on top, drawing 4,500 to 5,500 fans, very healthy by that point in time, led to the big match on April 27th, a hair versus hair cage match for the Southern title, where Idol vowed that he would refund everyone's ticket money if he didn't win and shave Lawler's head. The hair match was always a big draw, and Lawler had never lost once. The idea was that fans would figure Lawler would win, and then they'd get their money back. Lawler explained that Idol had won a big money court settlement from his 1975 plane crash and that he really had the money to pay the tickets back. The hope was that guarantee would lead to the first sellout in more than a year, but the crowd ended up at 8,500, basically showing fans didn't buy the money-back guarantee and that angle didn't work. In the match, Rich hid under the ring all day drinking beer and then came out at the finish of the match, causing Lawler to lose. Rich and Idol also crotched Lawler on the post, causing a near riot as fans stormed the cage trying to get at Rich, Idol, and Dangerly. In reality, Lawler was taking time off for surgery, so this was the angle to explain it. Lawler did have his hair cut, but it was in a fashionable crew cut rather than his head being completely shaved like everyone else had done in hair matches for the previous 2 decades. The next week, with Dundee and Rocky Johnson going for revenge for Lawler, drew 9,000. But by 2 weeks later, Dundee and Johnson versus Idol and Rich were down to 3,500. Lawler was back the next week in a singles match with Rich that drew just 5,800 fans, and while Lawler's return was not expected to necessarily sell out after the hot angle, the belief was they would be close to 10,000. Lawler and Dundee versus Rich and Idol the next week was at 4,000 for a first blood match. Lawler beating Idol to win the Southern title the next week drew 3,700. They did get 6,000 the next week for Lawler and Dundee beating Rich and Idol in a scaffold match. It was the return of Lawler from the hair match and the injury that was the sign that the glory days were over. Lawler and Mantell versus Dundee and Landell the year before was the last time Jarrett Promotions sold out the Coliseum. Several weeks in the usually great summer months were below 2,000, although Lawler going against new AWA champion Curt Hennig did 8,000 in August. One show with Lawler versus Bobby Jaggers drew $1,200 and $5,800. In 1988, they had the last hurrah. They were doing 2,000 or less most weeks, often under $10,000. The expansion of WWE and to a lesser extent, Jim Crockett Promotions, killed all the regionals. Many had already folded, and all would fold over the next few years with Jarrett as the last man standing. On May 9, 1988, Lawler vowed to retire if he couldn't beat Hennig for the AWA title. They did a long promotion of it, with them saying the fans vote on the referee. The story was that the fans in the Minneapolis area were voting heavily for Larry Hennig, Kurt's father, to referee, in theory making it almost impossible for Lawler to win. They pushed for the Memphis fans to get out of the vote and vote for Fargo to be the referee. With Fargo, Lawler's childhood hero, mentor, and later the person who put him over 14 years earlier in their big feud to make him a superstar, as the ref, Lawler pinned Hennig to win the AWA title before 8,000 fans, paying $52,000. It was billed as the climax of the dream that dated back to Lawler's chase of Jack Briscoe in 1974, of Lawler winning the world title. You were supposed to forget that at one point they created a CWA world title that Lawler had chased and won, when he could never get the NWA or AWA titles. And while it wasn't meant to be, it was the climax, and the last hurrah for Jarrett Promotions. On occasion they'd bring back legends and get good houses, but it was never the same. The chase was better than the capture. Lawler later unified the AWA title with the World Class and the USWA title in a feud with Kerry Von Erich, to create what was called the Unified World title. Lawler and Vern Gagne had a falling out over Gagne not paying him for the attempted pay-per-view show that Gagne put together with the help of Jarrett and Fritz Von Erich in Chicago that bombed. Lawler didn't return to the AWA after that point and was stripped of the title. He claimed he never lost it. Lawler was billed as the Unified World Champion in Memphis, the real champion. Lawler holding and winning back the Unified World title over and over again until the close of the promotion never did anywhere near the business of his 14 years of chasing. Of course, times had changed. Things got so bad that at one point when the rent was raised at the Coliseum, the promotion pulled out and the Monday night matches were held at the Big One Flea Market. Jarrett promoted for several more years, occasionally getting spurts of business like with promotional feuds against WWF when Vince McMahon would allow him to use some of his stars to challenge Lawler, or later with Tommy Dreamer and ECW wrestlers feuding with Lawler, and with Smoky Mountain Wrestling run by Jim Cornette. But by that point they were existing on fumes from the memories. Multiple books and documentaries have been written about this period. WMC and other stations over the years attempted to revive Saturday morning wrestling with Lawler, with Randy Hales and later Corey Macklin as promoter, and at times drew decently well, even very well, based on nostalgia, such as bringing back the Fabs, or feuding Lawler with Terry Funk. Sometimes Brown would be a part of the television shows, which still drew strong ratings from the nostalgia of the past. Sometimes Russell would be brought back. Often they would air nostalgia films with Lawler talking about his biggest matches and angles, at least the ones that survived on tape. People like to compare Jarrett with other wrestling promoters, like Vince McMahon or Eddie Graham, but really the closest comparison would be that his wrestling in the 70s and 80s was like Jerry Seltzer's roller derby in San Francisco from the late 50s into the early 70s. Lawler was Charlie O'Connell, only a bigger star and more friendly. It had its time when it drew ridiculous TV ratings and great live crowds. And its time ended. And when it was over, for decades, people tried to revive it. The original architect knew its time was over when it was and never got involved in attempted revivals, but always paid attention from afar and for decades after, kept up a link with their past, particularly when social media got big. And then later in life, they were dragged back in, Jarrett by his son, Seltzer by Spike TV with Roller Jam, with the idea that with a new formula, they could economically make the thing work. Of course, wrestling exists and thrives today with others in charge, and of all the territorial promotions, the one closest to modern WWE television was Jarrett's promotion. If there was a last hurrah, it was August 28, 2004, when Macklin's promotion drew 5,000 fans for Throwback Night 3, featuring Funk and Macklin, as a heel, facing Lawler and Hart with Valiant as referee. Wrestlers like Mabel, Coco Ware, Christopher, and Kamala, who all got their first big breaks in Memphis and by this point were out of mainstream wrestling, returned for the show. Macklin drew 3,500 with him teaming with Stan Lane of the Fabs and Fargo, who was 74 years old, to beat Lawler and Ricky Morton and Robert Gibson. The last Throwback show on April 16, 2005, drew 1,200 fans, as they had Macklin team with Paula Lawler, the wife of Lawler in the 80s, for revenge against Lawler and then girlfriend Renee. Memories of a classic period in Tennessee culture that existed for 2 decades, still continued for another decade. Fans who grew up on Memphis wrestling got their memories of the glory days revived every night as Brown continued to do the weather at WMC TV until 2015. For much of that 38-year period he was the most popular television news personality in the market, and WMC had him because of a wrestling war spurred on by Jerry Jarrett.